Let's go!
So this is the oral history of Marvel versus Capcom and X-Men Children of the Atom and all this kind of stuff. Polygon put up this article back in 2021. There is several other articles that accompany it that go over the crazy back-end history of games starting at X-Men Children of the Atom, moving up to several other titles in the future. So let's just start reading it. We'll get some information out of this that is pretty relevant and kind of amazing. So starting from the top, if there's a lesson to learn from Shaq Fu, it's that the mid-90s game industry would turn just about anything into a fighting game, a movie, a TV show, even a celebrity, drop it into a template, and that was often enough to greenlight a game. So when Capcom started moving beyond Street Fighter and experimenting with other fighting games, it wasn't a surprise to see it take on a license. This was the company, after all, that made Goof Troop and Yo Noid. For its first licensed fighting game, Capcom went for something a bit more aggressive. As part of an attempt to appeal to a Western audience, Capcom brought together some of the key staff behind Street Fighter II to imagine what an arcade game starring Marvel's X-Men would possibly be like. What they came up with was not only one of the most successful Capcom fighting game experiments, but it started a 20-plus year franchise and how it came about. It wasn't Capcom's first game with Marvel. In the days before Capcom became a fighting game factory, it rolled out multiple side-scrolling beat-em-ups. In '93, Capcom and Marvel released The Punisher, a side-scrolling Final Fight playbook. Marvel execs thought the game was too violent, and Capcom struggled to distinguish it amongst this sea of arcade beat-em-ups, but both sides were happy enough to leave the door open for another collaboration. Yeah, from what I understand, Punisher wasn't that successful as an arcade game. It's certainly grown a lot of popularity over time because it's like mega violent. It's kind of crazy. At the same time, Capcom Japan just had hired a few new employees who started making noise around the offices about interest in Marvel properties. From Katsuya Akimoto, Children of the Atom advisor and artist from Capcom Japan. He applied for the job at Capcom around the time Final Fight came out. Because the game had been so successful, Capcom was looking to hire more staff. And I was in college and saw a job listing, so I applied for the job as a graphic artist, animator, and pixel artist. Then I had an interview. I was asked to submit illustrations of the kind of art that I could draw. I remember submitting something Dragon Ball related. When they saw the materials that I had drawn, they found out I spoke English, and I told them that I really wanted a job related to American comics. When I joined Capcom, my first project was Punisher. And during my training, while I was learning how to draw and do pixel art, side-scrolling beat-em-up, Captain Commando came out. At the time, the entire video game market was the biggest in North America. North America had 50% of the market, Japan had 30%, 20% in other territories. The issue with Captain Commando was that even though it was supposed to be an American-inspired game, it actually looked very Japanese. It was a lot like some of the popular things that were around at the time, Lupin the Third, Speed Racer, Battle of the Planets, Gatchaman. All these properties tried to imitate American comic book culture. And sometimes they didn't look authentic. They didn't look quite American enough. I felt that if you wanted to go for the authentic American feel, you need to put a gun in somebody's hand. You had to properly culturalize things. A cheeseburger and a gun. We were trying to imitate people who themselves were influenced by American comic books. So our creations were twice removed from the original sources. When I joined Capcom in '91, I felt like I needed to introduce the Capcom staff to more authentic American comic books. So Takashi Tezuka, Children of the Atom planner in Capcom Japan. This guy's name is all over a ton of Capcom fighting games. Akimoto was always a big fan of American comics. Even as a kid, he joined Capcom. I remember when he joined the company, he was always giving American comic books to the designers in order to inspire them. So you could say Akimoto was like the Marvel ambassador inside at Capcom. He made a strong impression amongst the Marvel licensing staff, some of which remember him going by different nicknames. So, head of Marvel Entertainment, working back with Capcom back in the day. They had a great team at Capcom. I believe there was a guy I only knew as the Marvel Fan. Even on his business cards, he had his name written Marvel Fan. I remember there were a few meetings while everybody else was doing business stuff. He and myself had, and one of the other people were dueling sketches back and forth. So cool. Akimoto is probably one of the reasons that all this shit even exists, chat. He's probably one of the reasons his mega passion for like literally American comic books is probably one of the reasons MVC even is a thing. Justin, who is the executive vice president of Marvel Entertainment. on consumer products. I remember fondly, Dana and I believe that one of the person, Marvel Creative, Mike Thomas, I think, going up to visit Capcom, they sat us down, we had a conference room dedicated to us, and they brought in this kid called Marvel Zombie. Akimoto doesn't take credit for the idea behind Children of the Atom and says he never pitched an X-Men game. Former co-workers say that his influence around the office played a role in Capcom pursuing the license, getting Marvel to trust Capcom with the license and turning many at Capcom employees into Marvel fans. This shit all comes down to passion. Literally, it was a dream come true for one individual, and it all comes down to passion. So Akimoto says, officially, the only game I proposed at the time was Darkstalkers. But actually, the whole reason Children of the Atom was able to get off the ground was because the comic series Marvels had come out. It was painted by Alex Ross, and I think I had given the content of the publication. This was the kind of comic that could inform people about the American culture. They could see what kind of stories were being told, and that comic books could be seen as a reflection of people's views of American culture. So I thought it was important for me to show this to the staff at Capcom. I even translated it from English to Japanese, and after I did that, I think there was sentiment growing within the team that they wanted to make a Marvel game. And it turned out that Capcom, Yoshiki Okamoto, had acquired the rights to use X-Men in a video game. We weren't sure at the time what kind of video game he wanted to make, and that he had acquired the rights, and actually at the same time he also told me we could use all the Marvel characters. So I think in terms of the initial conceptualization of the X-Men game, I can't take credit for that. It would be Okamoto who secured the rights to do all this stuff. This is only a few years after X-Men had exploded, chat, right? So this is like 93. X-Men blew up, like massive cultural explosion in the early 90s. Like 1991 or so is when the X-Men reboot happened, and it was an event, like a massive event. Alex Jimenez, who was at Capcom forever, Children of the Atom support from CUSA. X-Men was something we had recommended on the US side. We recommended doing a Marvel head-to-head fighting game using superheroes. Superheroes are made to order for that, and we were told to get one of the most popular ones, and at the time, the mid-90s, it was the X-Men because they were at the top of the universe. The minute I heard Capcom Japan was interested, I jumped on top of Capcom as US Senior Vice President. Frank was like, hey, we gotta do this, you know? We gotta do this. I'm telling you, it's gonna make a fortune. It's gonna be great. It will cement us. No one else has done this yet. Data East came out with the side-scroller of the Avengers. I'm like, we're gonna blow them out of the water with this X-Men shit. I don't know a kid out there in America that doesn't want to be Wolverine. So we were just all over it. I pushed it and pushed it and pushed it. Scott from Capcom USA, the manager, said, it's weird considering where Marvel is today, but Marvel wanted to get into the market in Japan. And I think they were looking for opportunities. The video games are one of them to penetrate the market, kind of make their own properties a little more well-known. So back to Akimoto in Japan, who's the stan of Marvel and Capcom, right? Another thing that Konami had just released was an X-Men side-scrolling beat-em-up, which was a big hit in America. I think it was entertaining enough and people talked about it, but the thing is, a lot of players in Japan thought the game was unfair. For a lot of Japanese gamers, fairness is one of the most important elements of the gameplay experience. Because of that, it didn't do well in the Japanese market at all. Even though the 1991 X-Men comic had come out by then, Konami's X-Men arcade game was based on the animated pilot from the 1998 Pride of the X-Men. I think only one episode ended up being made, so by the time Konami's arcade game came out, it just seemed kind of old, and the visuals were obviously different from what the comic book had been showing us. So I thought it wasn't that interesting, and it was too old feeling, so I felt that we could do better. Good point. That game was early 90s, and it was very weird to have a game that was so representing X-Men characters from a time that I didn't even recognize. I was like, yeah, what? Back to Marvel. X-Men game was in development from Konami right as I came into the licensing group, you can tell, because honestly, there used to be a clip art for the arcade cabinet artwork, which I had tried never to do on video game cabinets. Part of it was we would always have to navigate those aspects like, which continuity is this project from? Is it the animated series, which was slightly different from the comics? If it was the comics, what time period is it from? What can we borrow? Which eras can we borrow from? All the crazy bullshit. Justin McCormack from Marvel is also saying, I just remember coming in and my boss, Jerry, who was a great guy, he was the kind of all about the numbers for video games between Sega and Capcom, and I was trying to remember whoever else we would do these like December 25th end of the year quarter deals, and they would be all verbal and Jerry would just whip these deals out. He really shot from the hip. He was a good businessman. He was like, make it work, we'll do it. Again, we have these 11th hour $500,000 deals in order to make budget, and then it would be like, okay, so now you guys got to sort out this mess that we just created. So that would be what happened. We would always be kind of banging or fixing it up or rehabilitating deals that have sort of been done in the 11th hour on a cocktail napkin because they were trying to make the quarter. Oh, the business side of things, chat. It's funny, going all the way back to the very beginning, there was always been business/management issues with the MVC series. Alex at the time, lucky for us, Marvel was not doing well financially. They were on the rocks, really on the rocks, and they were more than willing to license us the characters quickly and easily. They were desperate for money. So there you go. That's the example of like back in the 90s when this shit wasn't worth anything. They're described as 11th hour, million to $500,000 deals for the licensing rights of the X-Men and the Marvel characters. And that is back in the 90s. Imagine how expensive that is now. Imagine how expensive that is just to get an MVC collection re-released. That is 90s money when this shit isn't even popular. So they were on the rocks. They were like, sure, they're desperate for money. So they actually did file Chapter 11 in 96. They were desperate for cash. They gave us X-Men and we took it and ran with it. And the guys really did a great job with that one. Dana from Marvel says, I think Children of the Atom happened relatively early on, so it would have been very, as they say, easy to negotiate. I think the later games would have been more difficult. That had nothing to do with, or very little to do with, Capcom. As much as it was navigating the other deals in existence, I always had a great respect for our sales teams, and they had to navigate all that stuff. Back to Justin, we were always touting our hundreds of characters. The reality was, obviously, Spider-Man, X-Men were the most popular, but we had Punisher, which was popular. Silver Surfer was well known. At the point, the technology wasn't really great to render Silver Surfer. We had people coming in for Hulk on his own. There were random characters that people could come in and get licenses for because those characters had nothing on the dance card. Back to Akira Nishitani, man. As Capcom put together the pieces for that would be what would become Children of the Atom, the company needed someone to run the project. While Akimoto knew of the licensing inside and out, he didn't have the experience as a game designer or a project leader. So Capcom needed someone else to direct the game. Final Fight, Street Fighter 2 planner, Akira Nishitani. Shout out to Nishitani-san. I believe he is working at Arika still. Some of the dudes that helped out with Tekken, the dudes that released Fighting EX Layer. He's the guy that you see every once in a while posting pictures on Twitter of him doing the Hadouken. This is the guy that was the planner of Final Fight and Street Fighter 2 before he left Capcom in the early 90s. Also, planner for Children of the Atom. So Tezuka says, one day Akimoto called Nishitani into a meeting and he gave Nishitani the option. Do you want to work on Street Fighter 3 or do you want to work on an X-Men game? He chose X-Men. Akimoto says it was significant, you know, because Nishitani had made Final Fight and Street Fighter. So I thought his presence on this team would make things go well. It's so great to hear about this shit when you realize that like real people are making this stuff, right? Real people with ideas, and you have to get people that have to manage those ideas and get them into a game in a sound fashion to be a real thing and not just an idea anymore. Tezuka says, I was happy that he chose X-Men. When you deal with a franchise like Street Fighter, it's a fighting game, but the characters are basically human, limited to realistic movements. But with the Marvel series, you're dealing with superheroes who can do anything. And there had been a lot of requests to do something different. So I thought it was a good idea. It was Nishitani's decision, but even if I had made the call, I probably would have gone with X-Men anyway. Also, Street Fighter 3 would have been a lot of pressure since it's a huge popular series, and I didn't have the confidence for that. Another big thing that people are like, well, this is a big thing in the industry, chat. Well, I don't want to be the one to fuck it up. Imagine how much worse that is nowadays, right? Imagine being on the receiving end of the ire of fans. Back in the 90s, developers were nervous about that. I don't want the position, bro, because I don't want to get on the bad side of fans or be the one to screw this up. Imagine that nowadays, right? Like, holy crap. Imagine being on the receiving end of a fan base nowadays. Now it's a billion times worse. Akimoto says, Nishitani hit a point where he had done everything he could that they could think of with Street Fighter. He felt that there was really nothing left they can do without making changes to the fundamentals of Street Fighter, which they did. And so if he were to be involved in it, he felt like there would be no point. With X-Men, on the other hand, Nishitani saw the other characters and heard about their powers. He started getting a lot of ideas. For example, if you look at a character like Cyclops, he shoots beams from his eyes, right? And it didn't seem like there would be opportunities to do anything like that in the Street Fighter series. A different avenue, different ideas, different project, which is why this game and like Darkstalkers are so unique. They're very different, making two games in parallel. So around the time Capcom signed up for Coda, it signed up for a Super NES game, Mutant Apocalypse, and a second arcade fighting game, Marvel Superheroes. For Capcom's arcade group, that meant planning Coda, MSH in parallel, while one group of artists working on Marvel in the background with another group, along with the planners, programmers, and other staff initially focused on Children of the Atom. This happens a lot of time in the future of the MVC series, chat, where it's like, oh yeah, they're making two games at one time. Effectively, one game comes out and you immediately work on the next one, Marvel 3, Ultimate Marvel 3, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, X-Men vs. Street Fighter, that kind of stuff. Capcom ended up releasing Marvel Superheroes to arcades less than a year after Children of the Atom, establishing its Marvel fighting game series from the start. Some had differing opinions on whether Marvel Superheroes was a sequel, though given the similar mechanics but distinct story and cast. Tezuka says, "You could say that we made Marvel Superheroes as a sequel to Children of the Atom, in the same way that Street Fighter II Championship Edition was a sequel to Street Fighter II. But Coda only used X-Men characters. Marvel had way more popular characters in the Marvel Universe at the time, such as Spider-Man and Iron Man. And when we were making them, we figured they'd be viewed as different games. Sort of like, as the creators internally, we saw Marvel as a sequel, but as a commercial product, we wanted to present it as its own distinct game." I can tell you, that did not work. Marvel Superheroes was definitely viewed in the eyes of the public as the sequel to X-Men Children of the Atom, even back in the 90s. Alex Jimenez at Capcom USA was saying, "MSH came on the heels of Coda. Everyone is expecting us to make Coda 2. Everyone is expecting a sequel, and instead we literally a year, not even a year and a half later, when I got the word on that, I was obviously delighted, but I was like, oh, this is a change of pace. I was like, cool, we're not just doing an add-on like Darkstalkers did the follow-up with Night Warriors. We're doing a whole different game. This is cool." Marvel Superheroes marked Tezuka's chance to direct the game for the first time. After working as a planner on Capcom's beat-em-up Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, he played a supporting role on Coda while overseeing Marvel Superheroes in the background. Then, as design and programming staff finished their work on Coda, they rolled on to MSH, and the Coda director Akira Nishitani left Capcom. It was his last game at Capcom. Tezuka took over on a large scale, asking if Nishitani's departure opened up a slot for Tezuka to direct Marvel Superheroes. Tezuka says he saw it differently. "It's the opposite. It was decided from the start that I would be the director of Marvel. So if anything, Nishitani was allowed to quit Capcom because there was another director already ready for the next game." It wasn't like he was like smoozing his way into the position. They were just making these two games at the same time and two different directors because you can't have one director making two games. Moving forward, when designing the gameplay for Marvel games, Capcom made a conscious effort to move away from Street Fighter that it established many years before. Many fighting games in the era felt like Street Fighter 2 with a different skin, sharing the same moves and character archetypes, but Coda and MSH, Capcom leaned into what made the licenses unique. Characters could leap multiple screens up into the air, pull off 99-hit combos, fill the screen with the sorts of chaos that would normally be reserved for other mediums. Akira Yasuda, Children of the Atom artist. "If you compare X-Men to Street Fighter, the X-Men are mutants with powers. Part of what we had to consider when we were designing the game was how we could take the move system in our fighting games and express the special abilities that the X-Men had and translate them into a game. While some of the characters in the Street Fighter series could be said to have superhuman powers, for the Marvel games we did like Children of the Atom, all of the characters were defined by being mutants with superpowers, so from the get-go we decided to try and make their special moves more intense and flashy." Akimoto saying Coda was obviously about controlling the madness, and if you have a theme of controlling madness, the result will be something that looks wild, right? So Nishitani and Atsuda, I think, were big proponents of this idea of controlling madness, and I think that became a very prevalent theme in the game. So at the time, I personally did not have any worries about how that would turn out. In fact, I felt that the more flashy the game was, the more fun it would be. And I think that's what every team member felt as well. I mean, maybe we did too much, maybe we went too far, but we really didn't know that or feel that at the time. Kinda sick. This is the beginning of Marvel chat. The theme, Marvel, right? What is Marvel? Like, that whole thing starts from this mentality. Control madness. Controlled chaos, where it's like, we're going to give people the most chaotic controls ever, but we're going to put it in the hands of systems that will account for each other for the most part. James Chen in here too, FAQ writer for Children of the Atom. Combo system was free form. It was revolutionary at the time. Nobody knew how to do that kind of stuff. You could launch air combo, all that kind of stuff. Nobody was doing it, but I kind of figured it out after a while because I was obsessed with combos, and that was my game that actually got me started writing FAQs. I got known for writing FAQs at one point, and that was the game that kind of spurred that on. Ken from EGM. It was about pulling off these combos, especially a bunch of air combos. If you can't pull them off and stuff like that, I didn't really care for it. There's not much of a ground game, and I didn't like the variety of it. Alex Jimenez, we got a lot of that with Children of the Atom because we were doing double vertical screen. And when you had the super jumps going really high up, we got a lot of pushback. A lot of people didn't like that. They found it too confusing and too fast paced. And I countered by pointing out, well, you guys love Street Fighter 2 Turbo, and that was 10 times faster than this. As far as the screen being too high, bear in mind, these aren't martial artists artists. These are superheroes, so they should be able to go higher, faster. I mean, come on, half of them fly. Chris Tang. Originally, I didn't like those games. I thought having a beam cannon and doing many hits was cheesy. It kind of felt like, because I was really into skill-based fighting games, doing a combo and making the counter go up a higher number, that kind of meant something. If I got a 28 combo, I earned those hits. Capcom's Marvel games cheapened it. It was like, oh, you do a beam and you get 30 hits for free. We did do that intentionally. And the reason is because I think everyone that came from Street Fighter 2 Turbo and after became more and more focused on hardcore gamers. And the more casual gamers ended up getting shut out of that. So for the Marvel games, we wanted to make up for that by putting in a system that even ordinary players could enjoy easily. I would like to add to this reflected on me as a young-ass kid. The reason, what he's saying here, we wanted to make up for that by putting in a system that even ordinary players could enjoy easily. As a 10 or an 11-year-old, games like Street Fighter Alpha and other Street Fighter titles were having you do like double motions for supers and stuff. To combo into those supers was excruciatingly difficult for like someone that was young or people that were like normal people playing the video games. Why did I like the MVC games so much? Guess what supers were, dude? Supers were just one motion with 2 buttons or one motion with 3 buttons. So it was like, oh shit, that is so much easier. Now I can do supers from both sides. I can do them in the air. It's just a fireball with multiple buttons. That's so much better. I love that. That was honestly one of the things that got me into Marvel vs. Capcom inherently, was that, oh, I can actually do the big flashy moves now. I don't have to like figure out all the inputs and stuff like that. They just work. That's why we put all of the various combos that were easy to access. Unlike Street Fighter 2, where the different special moves all required their own individual inputs. For the Marvel games, we decided to make the most of them share common inputs for simplicity's sake. That was even why bad players could enjoy the games. Hey, calling me out. Fair enough. I give you the credit. So NBC Public Relations Manager at Capcom USA. I think the big impact and the multi-screen combos and all that stuff was intimidating. But I think that the license helped keep people engaged. Capcom and Marvel relationship. When developing Coda and MSH, Capcom and Marvel were simultaneously making games and learning how to work with one another. Though the companies had collaborated before on The Punisher, the new staff and rising expectations put a lot of focus on the partnership and communication between the two companies. I think this is where some fun-ass stories are. We were a very small group back then. My team was a grand total of 6 people. 6 people, including myself. We worked for marketing, but spent most of our time with licensing and sales teams, and they came in with Capcom. And from there on, we were connected to the hip for Capcom to the longest time. This is all pre-internet, so we had developed this very unique longhand form of working together, where we would look over the game documents, the character reference materials, what moves they do, what they couldn't do. We would get these 60-page faxes, or we would get a FedEx to internationally ship a few hundred pages in it with the character animations because it was just easier. They would basically handwrite the name. It might be like, oh, Super Pile Driver Twist, and they would sketch it out, an actual pencil drawing of what Omega Red was gonna do or what Wolverine was gonna do, and then we would go back in and tweak. Sometimes it would be fine. Other times we would make little tweaks, and sometimes we'd have to adjust the names because although they didn't always appear on screen, the last thing we wanted was a sort of an odd name showing up in one of these reference of how-to books. Once we got that process down, it all went relatively smoothly. A huge relatively, but because there was so much goddamn work. Justin McCormack, my bosses were more concerned about the money. Unless there was a backlash creatively, Dana, because he was more of a fanboy and was charged with creative, he tried to be the enforcer, and I was always brought in to kind of help Dana back up, you know, yell at people, that kind of thing. So back to the Marvel stand. Because I knew so much about Marvel franchises, people often came to me and asked me for info, and I ended up being the one who was kind of in charge of making the right ideas that were presented to Marvel. Sometimes people would come up with ideas that misunderstood their intentions or what they were willing to allow. But if the idea was good, and if the idea would make fans happy, then Marvel was obviously down to approve it. I spent a lot of time translating comics for Capcom and consulting with the team. For example, I'd point things out and answer their questions, like explaining the difference in size and weight between Juggernaut and Spider-Man, or explaining how dangerous Juggernaut was and his whole unstoppable thing, or helping them get the right level of pomposity and arrogance for Doctor Doom's dialogue. Lots of unique things like that. I remember going to New York and negotiating with Marvel what kind of characters we should use, how the game system worked, getting their understanding of that. I remember proposing some characters we wanted to use in Coda, but Marvel didn't agree to let us use them. The opposite was also true. They wanted us to put certain characters into the game, but then we turned them down because those characters didn't fit the game system we were using. One of the characters I wanted was Venom. We couldn't put him into the game. He was never in X-Men to begin with, but he didn't appear in Marvel Superheroes either, so Venom was a really major character, big enough that we probably would have had to get a whole separate license for him. So perhaps Capcom didn't want to make things too complicated. No one ever said that though, but the basic reason I think was because we based Marvel Superheroes on the Infinity Gauntlet storyline, and Venom wasn't a part of that. With licensing in general, you'd get a somebody that wanted to take an X-Men license and they would try to throw it in with members of the Fantastic Four or Spider-Man, or just somebody that showed up in an X-Men comic, and we're like, well, no, that's not quite what the X-Men are. And even though later, just dividing them up between the teams, which characters could work together, which ones don't. Are they good guys? Are they bad guys? There was also a little pushback because people would try to work in characters or properties, even backgrounds, that just weren't part of the character's universe. That's licensing and branding. We had a lot of back and forth between Capcom USA and Capcom Japan, especially Marvel Superheroes, more than Children of the Atom. Marvel Superheroes had a lot of debate on the characters, who could show up and who could not show up. I wanted to have Gambit in Coda. I remember I wanted to have Gambit, and they wouldn't let me have Gambit. They felt Gambit was a crook. He was a thief. So they didn't want to use Gambit. They didn't want to use Rogue because a Rogue's powers would be too difficult to reproduce on screen. Her ability to drain other people and take their powers, they thought it would be a little too risky to do, especially for basically a 16-bit video game. A little hard on that one. Marvel Superheroes was the one I really disagreed with. I really disagreed with using Blackheart. I thought there were so many other characters we wanted to use. I was like, The Thing, Ben Grimm, The Thing, Thor. Those were the main ones I wanted to do. They were like, no, can't go with that. Chat, I'll tell you what, dude. I remember seeing Blackheart for the first time in Marvel Superheroes. I was like, what the fuck is that? What is that? Thus begins the who the fuck is that side of Marvel vs. Capcom games, where you look at that character and you're like, bro, what are they from? I did not know what the hell Blackheart was, but granted, an extremely cool character. Back to Dana. This part, sort of sitting around in a room with an arcane fax machine, emailing back, well, barely emailing, sending notes back and forth about who the team could be, was always one of the most interesting parts. I still remember when we were talking about Marvel Superheroes, they asked for Shuma Gorath. It's always interesting because everybody's familiar with the Marvel mainstays, but when you're in a meeting and somebody is there and on their list of first asks has Shuma Gorath, it's kind of a surprise. Even our team, who was made up of some pretty hardcore geeks, I think half of them looked at each other like, who? Is that ours? Is that yours? On my team, they were like 3 of us that had shown up and around the comics and were like, the Doctor Strange villain? The squid with one eye? Okay, sure, by all means, you can have Shuma Gorath. Yeah, by all means, you take that shit. Takashi Tezuka. Unfortunately, Marvel Comics had very little visibility and awareness in Japan at the time. So I remember when we were trying to select characters for inclusion in the game, we wanted characters that Japanese gamers could easily identify with. The squid. Dana was like, what's interesting, in some cases, we had other existing deals, especially Spider-Man. Spider-Man had video games long before X-Men. So there were deals we needed to sort of navigate around. And even when they had branched out to do Marvel Superheroes, we needed to make sure the characters were not only balanced from a performance and play point of view, but from an intellectual property point of view. We didn't want the cast to be 3/4 Spider-Man characters. Gameplay was also an issue, right? Because there was plenty of parent groups that were at the point kind of hot about violence in games. And so that was something we had to really consider. And the reason I had to be involved, because I was the person on our side to say, well, who had the business of clout to say, no, you can't do that. But Capcom was always pretty compliant. The Japanese companies, they kind of did what they wanted to do. And they would, at a lot of times, just go ahead and ask for apologies later or apologize later and pretend they didn't understand what we were talking about. They would just sort of forge ahead. That's kind of how the Punisher game came out so violent. Somebody was asleep at the wheel on our side, and I was like, wow, this is a pretty heavy game. And it's a great game, but more violent than the video game industry was accustomed to at the time. Capcom just sort of doing shit and just, we'll ask for forgiveness later. Relatively, though. Capcom was chill. We had a good relationship with them. Marvel's approved commonly centered around character voices and visuals. Though toward the end of Children of the Atom's development, Capcom and Marvel came across a new challenge, getting the right voices. Alex Jimenez says, one thing that was funny, Capcom Japan called me up in a panic. to 2 weeks before the game was supposed to be shipped, they called up in a panic saying Marvel had turned down all of the voices they had come up with. All of the voiceover audio for the game had been rejected except for the Silver Samurai. And that was the only one they accepted. They rejected all the others. What are we gonna do? I was like, well, who did you get to do the voiceovers? We got English-speaking people. I'm like, were they Japanese? They have accents, you know? You can't have Wolverine with a Japanese accent. It doesn't work. So they were in a panic. They wanted me to talk to Marvel and get Marvel to go with it. And I'm like, look, they're not gonna go with it no matter what you do. So let me see what I can do. I called up the head of licensing at Marvel at the time, a gentleman named Joe Calamari, and he was like, president of licensing. I said, Joe, who does the voiceover work for the animated X-Men cartoon? And he's like, oh, it's a group up in Canada. They're really helpful. Beep, boop, beep. He goes, you want me to send you up? I'm like, yeah, please. Can I get their number? So I called him up. I told them who I was, what I was trying to do. And the woman up there was wonderful. She was the head of Dome Productions in Toronto. They're like, okay, so which characters do you need? I told her which characters I need. They're like, all right, we can get you these characters plus the studio time is about 5,000 too much. And 5,000 bucks for all the characters in the studio time, Canadian? I was like, oh, and I immediately set it all up. And I called Capcom's localization team in Japan. I said, hey, tell the guys to pack their bags. We're going to Canada. He's like, what do you mean? I go, we're going this Thursday to Canada. Are you sure they're going to approve these voices? I go, yeah, because they're the characters who they've actually approved already. They're already preset. Joe set it up and assured me of pre-approval. We're going to Canada for 5,000 bucks. We got the whole thing. They were delighted. We got to work with the actual X-Men. We actually used that as one of the sale points for what we were using. We were connecting it directly to the animated series. We were using the actors from the animated series. So Dana says, I do remember that situation. I don't remember it quite being that big of a time crunch, but yeah, they submitted, and what they wound up happening is the first game was very much a lovely trial by fire, where all these creative people, both on our sides and their side, were used to working in their own very special and unique ways. And suddenly we're working together trying to get a game done. You know, their team, maybe they had 3 or 4 people that spoke English. We didn't speak any Japanese. So we literally, with the first release, we're trying to pioneer the way we were going to hopefully do more in the future. I do remember the voices coming in, and that being basically the path of least resistance, was for them to just essentially employ the actors from the show. And I don't remember if they got all of the voice actors, because some of the voice actors, they hired a studio in Canada to do the voices, and I remember it quick. I don't remember it being just 2 weeks, but I'll still give them the benefit of the doubt. It makes for a good story. Coda comes out in arcades late 94, early 95. It made an instant impact on players. There had been plenty of licensed fighting games before, but it was the first to break through to competitive fighting game fans and show that licensed games could stand up well to hardcore fans and favorites of Street Fighter. Akamoto remembers the arcade game selling very poorly in Japan and below expectations in the US. Those who we spoke to on the US side recall the game being one of Capcom's biggest successes of the mid-90s. Dana says, we couldn't have planned it better if we tried. It was a huge seller. It's when the X-Men animated series had come on the air, so it was a huge, huge thing. I mean, exceeding everybody's expectations. Chris says, from Street Fighter's series public relations manager, this was the 90s, dude. There was the X-Men era, the cartoon that was on and making Marvel more money than they would have made until the movie started. So that was Marvel's bread and butter at that point in time. Tezuka says, of course, the Marvel games were developed primarily targeting overseas markets, but in Japan, the fact that a Japanese company like Capcom was making those games was obviously its own marketing point. In terms of the American comics market in Japan, I think Capcom games helped Marvel become more popular. Alex Jimenez says, Capcom banked on the popularity of X-Men. They took a big gamble. I've got to give them credit for that. They took a bit of a gamble on Coda. It was their first hero licensed game with Marvel, and they took a little gamble on that, and it paid off extremely well. Children of the Atom was a very, very popular game, very successful title. Following Children of the Atom and Marvel Superheroes, Capcom took the series in a different direction with its first crossover fighting game, X-Men vs. Street Fighter. As the series grew, it eventually transformed into Marvel vs. Capcom and became one of Capcom's long-running staples with multiple sequels, and the only one of Capcom's fighting game franchises, apart from Street Fighter, to last more than 20 years. Dana says, generally, what would happen is we would have a deal or two for arcade games. If that went well, Capcom would come back and say, we want to do more. And we wanted to either say yes or no. And Capcom relationship was unique in that it really did grow exponentially. We went from trying out one game to being very happy about the results and going on to another game and another game and another game. But each time they would expand, they would try to add more stuff. So it snowballs. It adds with this 1, and then it goes into 2 if everybody performs. Goes into 3 and 4, and then when it becomes relatively easy to port, that motherboard over the arcade game made it to the home version. Then all the brakes came off because suddenly we were able to take their area of expertise, which rarely was the stand-up game, and bring them home. When we got to X-Men vs. Street Fighter, I don't think that we had ever done a character crossover before in licensing. It was a big deal. They're like, we want to do this. And we're like, all right, let's try it. That's the end of part 1. The beginning history of fucking Marvel vs. Capcom. It's such a cool story, right? It's such a sick story of how, like, all this shit, impossible as it may be, somehow came together because people really gave a shit, right? I love it, dude. Like and even I've been in game development situations exactly like this. Like, it's crazy to me to see so many things happening here that are honestly like one-to-one fucking identical with games like Killer Instinct, where you just get some people behind the scenes that just love this shit so much and been waiting to do something like this for so long. And now that they have the opportunity to do it, they're like, oh, I'm going in. Like they just fucking nailed it. They just kill it. And I think that's something that is obvious now in this industry. I think passion is obvious. I think it's pretty clear when you have devs that are going ham and they love this stuff. And it's clearly a passion and they clearly have a cool idea. And that stuff resonates. I think art resonates. I think it's something that you don't immediately realize. It's one of those things where you don't realize you want this until you see it. That's something that's hard to describe. Fans are usually very bad at describing what they want. Just in general, you have to give them what they want without them telling it to you. And when you are able to provide that thing, you are now like, oh, you've reached it. Like you did it. You found something. And that's the problem, is that if you just listen to people that just want something and you deliver, it usually isn't exactly what they want. It ends up not being the thing that resonates as much as you think it would. You have to come up with something new. You have to give them something that they did not even realize that they wanted, you know? And that's kind of what was happening here. It's like, hey, let's get a Japanese company and do a crazy like English thing. Let's take something from the West. Let's do our own like Eastern style take on this. And let's perfectly time it around when something is like relatively blows up, because it didn't blow up as big just yet. And it hits. And all of a sudden, oh shit, no, this is something pretty big. And now we're getting into like the crossover part of it, where it's like, oh, well, this begins the crossover. Like this is the beginning of the video game crossover.